You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96, and we have just completed the Jazz Zone with Tien Providence, and Tien was interviewing Maurice Gordon, a young man who has spent half of his time in Toronto and half his time in Jamaica. Great guitarist. He is doing a tribute to, I guess his last tribute is, he's paying tribute to Grant Green, Ernest Ranglin, and so on and so forth. But we just completed that. But we are getting ready to talk to Dr. Gerald Horne. And Dr. Gerald Horne is the author of many books. His current volume is The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1885.
65.
65. What did I say?
85.
Oh, 65. Oh, my goodness. I don't have my glasses on. You're absolutely right. It's 65. Yeah, but anyway, you are in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is there's a lot of reports going out, and basically, what is really going on in Los Angeles as we speak?
Well, actually, I'm speaking to you from Victoria, British Columbia, and I'll get to Los Angeles in a moment. But of course, the pressing issue of the day, perhaps of the year and longer, is the prospect of World War III erupting as a result of this aggressive war that Israel is waging against Iran. Just to back up, on Thursday evening, I was doing an interview with WPFW, Pacifica Station in Washington, about 5:30 p.m. Pacific. And in that interview, I was talking about the fact that Britain and Canada and New Zealand and Australia and Norway had just issued sanctions against two ultra-rightist ministers in the Netanyahu cabinet in Israel. I mentioned the so-called BB-Gate scandal, that is to say, Iranian activists apparently hacked into Israeli computers and emerged with a treasure trove of documents. This, by the way, is yet to be covered on this side of the Atlantic, at least not in the New York Times nor Washington Post, that brings forward all manner of detail about how the International Atomic Energy Agency, which just issued a report rebuking Iran, has been in bed with the Netanyahu clique for a number of years. Rafael Grossi, the head of the agency, apparently was leaking confidential material to the Israelis that helped them to assassinate atomic scientists in Iran. By the way, there was an interview with him in the Financial Times of London. That's where he suggests he wants to be the next leader of the United Nations. I trust and I hope that the reportage on this scandal will deep six that particular prospect. The documents also talk about Mr. Netanyahu's successful attempt to blackmail domestic opponents, about the fact that the United States was involved in bribing leaders of certain Arab countries in order to get them to sign on to the ill-fated Abraham Accords, that is to say, that pact under Trump 1.0 that allowed countries like Morocco and the United Arab Emirates to warm up relations with Israel and turn their back on the Palestinian struggle. We talked about the fact that we had expected this week a pivotal turning point in Palestinian struggle for self-determination, a conference at the United Nations co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia that would mark a gigantic step forward on the road to Palestinian self-determination. We finished the interview, and then the interviewer called back a few minutes later and says that Israel has just assassinated a number of leaders of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Tehran, assassinated more atomic scientists. And footnote, we wonder if Mr. Grossi is complicit in that latter despicable episode. We also found out and reported on the fact that apparently the Israelis were concerned that today June 15th. There was supposed to be a meeting in Oman between U.S. negotiators and their Iranian counterparts with regard to the Iranian nuclear program. That is all detail that helps perhaps to shed light on this war of aggression that Israel is waging as we speak against Iran. There is the prospect of other powers being dragged into this conflict. And in fact, you can easily speculate that Mr. Netanyahu expects that ultimately US imperialism will intervene on the side of Israel, particularly as days proceed when we come to see that Israel has bitten off more than it can chew. And we also know that historically, Mr. Netanyahu has been lusting for a war against the Islamic Republic in which US imperialism would participate. Interestingly enough, things do not seem to be going well for the Israelis after their apparent heavy blow against the Iranians this past Friday, June 13th. There are reports that we have yet to confirm that Mr. Netanyahu, in fact, is not in Israel. He's on some Greek island. Because apparently he was really spooked when during a conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, they sent drones to his residence to take him out, to use that euphemism. We've also received reports that F-35 fighter jets operated by Israeli pilots have been shut down. Now, I haven't been able to confirm those reports. Those reports are out there. But what we do know is that Israel is at a disadvantage because they're delivering their ordnance, their bombs, through these planes. Planes have to perform efficiently. Fighters have to be alert and have to have had enough sleep. They have to fly over the territory of third-party nations in order to get to Iran. I assume that these third-party nations are cooperating with the Israelis in that regard, whereas the Iranians are using missiles. And if you look at the footage of the missiles that are being shot into Tel Aviv, what oftentimes the news hosts do not share is that these missiles oftentimes they have decoys that they shoot out before the payload is delivered. And so when you see decoys being shot out of the air, the TV host oftentimes comes to the incorrect conclusion that those are missiles with payloads being shot out of the air. In any case, we also see that Mr. Trump, who jumped out ahead of the pack on Friday night, Saturday morning, lauding the Israeli attack, now apparently is backtracking. So I guess he can see which way the conflict is going. He had a call with Mr. Putin just the other day, and he expressed the desire for some sort of ceasefire and talks. The European nations have been exposed. That is to say that, like many, they have not rebuked Israel, which after all is a nuclear power and supposedly is attacking Iran because it feels Iran is on the threshold of being a nuclear power. But Israel is not a party to international agreements on non-proliferation, whereas Iran is. And I also understand in that context that the Iranians have attacked an Israeli nuclear facility in Dimona, and if so, we'll have to see what the Europeans have to say about that. The British have moved their personnel closer to the point of conflict. I trust and I hope that does not portend Britain's interference in this conflict on the side of Israel. In any event, I think it also provides further fodder for the prosecutors at the International Criminal Court, who, after all, are seeking the delivery of Mr. Netanyahu and his comrades to The Hague to stand trial, not least because of the depredations inflicted upon Palestine, upon Gaza in particular. The Israelis, as you may have been able to infer from what I've said thus far, may have bitten off more than they can chew. That is to say, it has a population of roughly 9 to 10 million versus Iran's 83 million. Of that 9 or 10 million, a significant percentage are of Arab ancestry, are not necessarily enthusiastic about this conflict. We can easily surmise that Israel is able to start a war, but the question is, can they finish the war? Do they have the stamina and the institutional fortitude to take this war to its conclusion from their point of view? With regard to US imperialism, we already see signs of a split in the Trump base. That is to say, obviously, the Zionist section of the base are acting as cheerleaders, but you have other forces represented by the right-wing commentator, Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, who are not necessarily gung-ho about this war. After all, Mr. Trump, in his inauguration address, talked about stopping these forever wars, and I'm afraid to say that there were so-called progressives who thought that he would do so. In fact, I'm afraid to say as well that there are certain of our Arab American friends, particularly in the state of Michigan, who thought that he would do so. But I think that the lesson that should be drawn is that when you make an analysis, you just can't look at a particular personality, even one as large as Mr. Trump. You have to look at their base. You have to look at the social, political, and economic forces that propelled this candidate into office, and then make an analysis based upon which that personality, speaking of Mr. Trump, can adhere to his pledges and promises. I had thought that was political science 101, but silly me, obviously, I misjudged the situation. I think at the end of the day, perhaps the most significant victors in this conflict will be China and Russia, particularly China, because as this conflict unfolds, I don't think it's going to be ending anytime soon. And if so, once again, it delays the showdown that the Trump wing of the U.S. ruling class, and even the non-Trump wing to a certain degree, the showdown they would like to have with China. I should also say that in order to resolve this conflict, as the phone call with Trump and Putin tends to suggest, there's going to have to be some sort of role for Russia, which after all, not only has good relations with Iran, but has also been able to maintain relations with Israel. But finally, let me say that in terms of the media, obviously I've been tuned in to Press TV of Iran, tuned into Al Jazeera from Qatar, but also I've been tuned into TRT from Turkey or Tükiye. And Turkey, of course, has a star-crossed relationship with Israel. It's been accused, that is to say, Mr. Erdogan, the leader, has been accused of being two-faced with regard to Israel, that is to say, making rhetorical blasts at the same time, helping Israel in various manners, and certainly with his destabilization of the al-Assad regime in neighboring Syria, which has brought to power Mr. al-Shara, which is fervently and violently anti-Iran. Mr. Erdogan did a real favor for Israel. But having said that, TRT has been very forthright in terms of the analysts that they brought on that have presented a broad brush and oftentimes analytical point of view with regard to this war. And so TRT also may be a victor in this conflict.
You're listening to Diasporic music. Had you finished, Dr. Horne? I'm sorry if I cut you off.
Well, let me turn to the other pressing matter, which is the domestic scene in Los Angeles, with Mr. Trump dispatching U.S. Marines to the streets of Los Angeles, with the National Guard to federalize over the objection of Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass. In fact, Mr. Trump has threatened the arrest of the governor of California and the mayor of Los Angeles. We have talked on this broadcast and elsewhere about the United States being in the foothills of fascism, I'm afraid to say that as a result of what we witnessed this past week in the City of Angels, the United States has advanced further along on the road to fascism because there is a distinct possibility that martial law could be declared, and that would allow for the suspension of civil liberties, the mass detention of political opponents, perhaps starting with the governor of California and the mayor of Los Angeles. In some ways, I think that some of the commentary has been lacking with regard to a historical perspective, because in many ways, what we're witnessing is the fruit of counter-revolution, or the fruits of counter-revolution. That is to say, there has been a long trajectory and history of counter-revolution on these shores. I would argue starting with 1776, but certainly continuing through 1836 with the Texas secession from Mexico, because Mexico had moved towards abolition of slavery. We all know that it's rather ironic, paradoxical, that folks of Mexican ancestry are being rounded up by the immigration authorities of the United States of America when California became U.S. territory as a result of a war of aggression waged against Mexico, 1846 to 1848. And there was a treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that said that what's happening today, that is to say, discrimination and persecution of those of Mexican ancestry, did not happen per that treaty. That's just one more treaty that the U.S. rulers have thrown into the dustbin. We should also say that the unleashing of the U.S. military against the denizens of this continent is nothing new. We're all familiar with Wounded Knee in South Dakota, 1890, when the U.S. military massacred the people we refer to as the Lakota and the Sioux. We also know that there is a long history, and this is what we're going to have to be alert to. And I say this in particular in light of the political assassination in Minnesota just yesterday by some sort of rogue element. That is to say, historically in the United States, settler colonialism was accomplished not only through the barrel of a gun wielded by the military, you had settlers themselves organized to rout and liquidate Native Americans, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, what is now the state of Washington, what is now the state of Oregon. And then they would go to Washington with their begging bowl to get reimbursed for their bullets, for their rifles, for their horses. And then, of course, they would do a markup so that they would benefit in a lucrative manner and therefore walk away not only with the land of the Native Americans, but with a corrupt state in terms of the money they had ripped off from the U.S. taxpayers in Washington, D.C. And so I think that part of the problem we face right now in the United States of America is an inadequate understanding of how we reach this point. And I dare say that until we gain that understanding, we're going to be perpetually in trouble. But on a more positive note, and let me conclude this segment with this point, June 14th, yesterday, was the No Kings protest. And Toronto, I understand, since you have a king, it was called No Tyrants protest. And of course, you may wonder why the organizers in the United States could not come up with a consistent line and just call it a No Tyrants protest. But that's a protest. So that's another story for another day. In any event, apparently there were substantial protests from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That bodes well, I would imagine, in terms of beating back Mr. Trump, who, by the way, had this military parade yesterday, June 14th, marking supposedly the anniversary of the founding of the U.S. Army, but actually helping to mark his 79th birthday. I'm sure that there are those in the No Tyrants protest who are promising or hoping that he does not have many more birthdays to come.
From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, that's the Marine. That's their theme song, isn't it?
It certainly is. And of course, well, since you raised it, one of my books for 2026 will deal with the roots of that particular Marine hymn, because, of course, the United States in the early 19th century was sending forces to Libya, Tripoli, and to North Africa in general in order to rescue, they said, Euro-Americans who had been enslaved, particularly in Algiers, by the way.
Yeah, Algiers. I'm getting ready to get off track again because we could talk about Algiers all day and all night. But I think Belinda had some questions for you.
Yeah. I don't know where. If you want, did you finish with like the settler colonialism, or do you want to move on to the Persian Gulf interference in Africa?
Well, with regard to the latter point, we have to pay more attention to the fact that there are very important and profound political processes unfolding as we speak in the Sahel nations, speaking of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. We also know that there are residents, if not citizens, certain Persian Gulf monarchies, particularly the United Arab Emirates, who, in my estimation, are seeking to sate and satisfy the religious zealots in their homeland by deflecting them to interfere in the internal affairs of the Sahel states. Because one of the major problems that the Sahel states face right now are these religious insurgencies. Not only the Sahel states, but northern Nigeria is on fire right now because of these religious insurgencies. US imperialism is concerned that these brush fires will spread from regimes they're opposed to, such as the Sahel states, into regimes that they're not opposed to, particularly Cote d'Ivoire, which has a substantial population of Islamic descent, which the Persian Gulf monarchs feel can be fodder for this religious insurgency, not to mention spreading from Burkina Faso into Ghana, for example. So this is a major problem, and we haven't had that sufficient attention to this problem. And let's hope that raising this right now on this particular program will then allow for deeper investigation and indeed deeper protests against the kinds of atrocities that these religious insurgents are inflicting on that part of Africa.
Dr. Horne, how do you think the support of African people in other parts of the world, how do you think they responded to the leadership of the Sahel states?
Well, I spoke about this on a program sponsored by one of your fellow Canadians, a podcast, Dimitri Lascaris, where I pointed out in his podcast, Reason to Resist, that when Ibrahim Traore, who, by the way, is in his mid to late 30s, who in his recent trip to Moscow on Victory Day, May 9th, was addressing those assembled in Russian, when he showed up at the inauguration of President John Mahama in Accra, Ghana, some weeks ago, there was stormy applause when one of his representatives showed up in Gabon for inauguration of President Nguema. There was similar stormy applause. I think that Ibrahim Traore has captured the imagination of many in Africa. I think that they see in him a reincarnation of Thomas Sankara, who we recall led Burkina Faso up to his tragic assassination at the hands of his erstwhile comrade, Blaise Compaoré, in 1987. And Mr. Sankara blazed the trail that Mr. Traore is attempting to trod in terms of executing progressive policies concerning state intervention in the economy, particularly with regard to the mineral sector. You can say the same thing with regard to Mali. And as I pointed out on Reason to Resist, Canada is implicated. Canada is a mining superpower, and they have been resisting, that is to say, these Canadian mining companies playing ball with the regimes, particularly the regime in Mali, which has led to sharp disputes. In fact, I've suggested that the elbows up movement, which at root I would like to think is an anti-US imperialist movement, that ultimately Ottawa might be forced to compromise because the mining companies in Canada may have to rely upon the muscle of US imperialism in order to push back successfully and aggressively against the Sahel regimes. That's another thing we're going to have to keep a close eye on, particularly as we approach the G7 meeting, which is initiating itself today and going till Tuesday, as I understand it, in Alberta, Canada,
Yes.
where we expect fireworks from Mr. Trump. He likes to show up leaders of other countries when he's on the world stage. Witness how he tried to sabotage Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa during their meeting in the Oval Office. I think that the Canadian progressives who suggested that Mr. Trump should not be allowed to land in Canada had a fair point in light of the fact that he's challenged Canadian national sovereignty, and in fact is, as he said, trying to use, quote, economic force, unquote, in order to get Canada to bend the knee and bow to US imperialism. In any case, we're going to have to keep a close and careful eye on that summit in Alberta, because we also, to circle back, we'll have to pay attention to what the leaders have to say about this conflict raging as we speak between Iran and Israel.
Speaking of Canada in terms of settler colonialism, it's some people have made.
Hello?
It looks like we dropped, Norman dropped. So I think he was going into around settler colonialism.
Well, that's a big subject. Perhaps you can elaborate. Or move on to another question.
Okay. So did you want to talk about your upcoming book?
Well, it was mentioned at the top, the capital of slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. It's dropping any day now. It's been delayed for reasons that I'm not certain and sure about. But in any case, once again, it helps to expose this mythology about the United States creation being a step forward. Certainly that was not the position of the Black people who were enslaved and whose numbers expanded exponentially from 1776 until the end of the Civil War in 1865. And they were perpetually on the warpath, particularly in the capital, speaking of Washington, D.C., particularly during the War of 1812, which, by the way, you had a number of Native Americans on the warpath, too, against U.S. Settler colonialism. Tecumseh, the great Native American warrior, died fighting shoulder to shoulder with British troops during the War of 1812 as the United States was seeking to take over Canada in order to do to the First Nations there what they were doing to First Nations south of the border. So watch for that book. It should be available any minute now.
Tecumseh, is Tecumseh or Tecumseh? Was he a Choctaw?
No, the Choctaws were further south in Mississippi.
They were from Mississippi. Yeah, Mississippi, yeah. What was the name that you said? My phone dropped.
Repeat the question, please.
I said you were mentioning a native, a First Nations leader, and I thought you were talking about the Choctaw, Tecumseh. And I knew Tecumseh was he was from Choctaw, but he was from Mississippi, Oklahoma, Louisiana area. He was not. That's where he was from, right?
Well, my understanding is Tecumseh was from further north. For example, in the area we now call Indiana. It's very interesting. I saw a documentary some months ago with regard to the Zionists in Indiana who were trying to educate young people about the Holocaust. And what was interesting, this is taking place in Indiana, which is obviously named after the Indians. And they had little or nothing to say, seemed unaware of the fact they were talking and living and residing on land that once belonged to the Native Americans who were liquidated. And so they're wringing their hands justifiably about what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1930s, but wholly and totally unaware of what happened to make Indiana a blood-soaked land in the 19th century. That's the typical sort of ignorance that paves the way for fascism in the United States.
Just to know, Tecumseh was Shawnee, and the territory was like Ohio, and it went into Canada. So just to give people context, he wasn't Choctaw, he was Shawnee. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly.
And of course, Ohio borders Indiana, for example. I mean, the more I study Indigenous history, and that's what I'm doing right now in Victoria, British Columbia, this project on comparative settler colonialism between what is now British Columbia and what is now the states of Washington and Oregon, is that I keep assuming that, for example, when I studied Texas and published a book on Texas, I thought that there could be no more horrendous atrocities than what took place in Texas, the Lone Star State. And then I'm looking at Oregon and Washington, and I have to revise that point of view. And I dare say that if I were to do a study of Ohio and Indiana, I'd have to revise that particular point of view as well.
You are listening to Diasporic Music. More questions, Belinda?
Did you want to talk and remind listeners about your talk on the Cuban Revolution upcoming?
Well, yeah, that'll be taking place in Vancouver, British Columbia on July 26th, the Cuban national holiday. Be there or be square. The Canadian-Cuban Friendship Group will be hosting us. And one of the points I'm going to make is that I trust that not only the activists, but the authorities in Ottawa recognize that they today have quite a bit in common with Cuba. Just like Cuba has been subjected to economic force since 1959, Mr. Trump has pledged and promised that he will subject Canada to economic force in order to get Canada to become the 51st state. And so there is a material interest in heightened solidarity between Canada and Cuba because they have a similar foe and have a similar problem. And it would just be smart foreign policy on the part of Ottawa to heighten relations with Havana. Whether or not that'll take place is another story.
And I think we have run out of time. So is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'll talk to you soon.
All right. I would like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us on time and sounding all right. And Melinda Francis, do you have any parting words for the listeners?
Yeah, I'm wishing listeners a safe week and enjoy the going into, summer kind of vibes. And yeah, we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
All right, take care.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.